It is the summer of 1940, and a farmer in the rolling hills of Kent is walking a fence line he has walked 1,000 times before. The morning mist has not yet burned off, and the fields are quiet except for the distant clatter of a milk lorry on the lane below. He steps over a patch of bracken near the tree line, adjusts the brim of his cap, and carries on without breaking stride. What lies beneath his feet, what he has walked over without a second thought for weeks, is a cramped, timber-lined chamber roughly the size of a garden shed, sunk 2 meters into the earth. Inside that chamber, right now, are 4 men. They have been there since dusk the previous evening. They have eaten cold tinned food, spoken in whispers, and slept in shifts on wooden bunks no wider than a man's shoulders. They carry enough explosive to destroy a fuel depot, enough poison to kill a senior officer, and orders, written and memorized, to use both without hesitation. They are not commandos sent from London. They are the farmers' neighbours, and they have been living this double life for months. This is the story of Britain's auxiliary units, one of the most secretive and extraordinary irregular forces ever assembled by any nation in modern warfare. It is a story of buried bunkers, civilian volunteers, and a shadow army that was never meant to survive its own activation. It is a story of men who prepared, with quiet resolve, to become ghosts. To understand why these men were living in the ground, you must understand how close Britain came to the unthinkable. In the spring and early summer of 1940, the situation facing the British government was not merely desperate. It was, in any rational military assessment, catastrophic. France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force had been extracted from Dunkirk, but the extraction had come at a cost that Churchill's public pronouncements carefully obscured. The army that returned from France was, in operational terms, largely stripped of its heavy equipment. Artillery pieces, armoured vehicles and stores of ammunition had been abandoned on the beaches. What Britain possessed in June 1940 was will, a functioning navy, and a territorial force that was, in several critical sectors, equipped with whatever could be scraped together from armouries and depot stores. The threat of German invasion, Operation Sea Lion, as it was then planned in Berlin, was real enough that the War Cabinet authorised preparations that, in peacetime, would have seemed fantastical. Pillboxes were thrown up across the southern counties. Anti-tank ditches were dug across farmland that had not seen violence since the Civil War. Signs were removed from roads. Church bells were ordered to remain silent unless used to signal a landing, and civilians along the coast were told in plain terms that they might need to evacuate at short notice. But planners at the highest levels understood something that public communications could not acknowledge. If the Germans landed in strength and pushed inland, the regular army, however bravely it fought, might not hold. Somewhere in the contingency planning, a harder question was being asked. If the enemy occupied British soil, what then? The answer, worked out in secret over the summer of 1940, would produce one of the most remarkable organisations in British military history. The problem was not simply one of resistance, the problem was one of deniability, duration, and survival. A conventional guerrilla force, if captured, could be identified, interrogated and rolled up. It needed to be invisible until the moment of action and then vanish again. It needed to be local, not parachuted in, but indigenous, made of men who knew every hedge, gate and drainage ditch in their operating area. And it needed somewhere to hide. The answer to that last requirement was the operational base, the organisation responsible for the auxiliary units, and for the OBs as they came to be known, was constructed almost single-handedly in the summer of 1940 by a man named Colin Gubbins, a soldier of unconventional instincts who had already written 2 pamphlets on guerrilla warfare and partisan tactics. Working from a headquarters in Coleshill House, a 17th century Palladian manor in Oxfordshire, that presented a deliberately unremarkable facade, Gubbins and his team began recruiting, training, and equipping what would eventually become a force of roughly 3,500 men, organised into several hundred independent patrols. Each patrol consisted of 6 to 8 men. Each patrol had its own operational base, and the operational base was, in engineering terms, a masterpiece of concealment. The typical OB was a prefabricated chamber, constructed using corrugated steel sections produced by a firm called Nissen Huts, the same Nissens that had sheltered soldiers across the Western Front 2 decades earlier. The sections were assembled below ground, in a pit typically measuring roughly 4 metres by 3 metres and 2 metres deep, then roofed over with timber, topped with soil, and carefully replanted with turf or bracken to match the surrounding terrain. Access was through a shaft concealed beneath a tree stump, a bush, or in some cases a wooden hatch disguised as part of a hedgerow. The shaft itself was usually fitted with a removable ladder and a sliding steel door that could be secured from the inside. Inside, the space was divided into a sleeping area, a supply store, and an operational section. The bunks, in 2 or 3 tiers, bolted to the steel walls, were narrow enough that a man sleeping on his side had perhaps 30 centimetres of clearance between his shoulder and the opposite wall. Ventilation was provided by a concealed pipe running to the surface, capped with a baffle to prevent detection. Lighting was battery-powered, and batteries were one of the unit's most carefully rationed resources. The smell was one that every veteran of these places later described in virtually identical terms: damp earth, mildew, gun oil, and the particular staleness of recycled air in an enclosed space below the water table. Crucially, the OB was designed not for comfort, but for survival, and for a very specific kind of survival. It was built to hide men for up to 10 days at a stretch, while German forces moved through or occupied the surrounding area. It was, in the bluntest terms, a tomb that the occupants were expected to leave. The men recruited to fill these bunkers were almost universally drawn from rural occupations. Farmers, gamekeepers, foresters, and farm labourers made up the bulk of the auxiliary units. The reasoning was deliberate. These men knew the land intimately. They could move across country at night without maps. They could read weather, identify animal tracks, understand drainage and terrain in the instinctive way that comes only from working a landscape over years or decades. They were also, and this mattered considerably, already armed. The Game Act had ensured a wide distribution of shotguns and .22 rifles across the rural population, and many of these men had handled firearms their entire adult lives. They were recruited quietly, approached individually, usually by an existing contact or a local Home Guard officer, who had been quietly briefed. And they were told, in terms designed to leave no ambiguity, that the work was extremely dangerous and that, in the event of invasion, they should not expect to survive longer than 2 weeks. That figure was not pessimism. It was the planner's honest assessment of life expectancy once a patrol began active operations behind enemy lines. The men were told this. Most of them volunteered anyway. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Training took place at Coleshill and at a handful of subsidiary sites across Britain. It covered close quarters combat, the use of explosive charges, the handling of a range of specialist weapons, and, perhaps most distinctively, the use of materials and techniques drawn from the emerging science of unconventional warfare. The auxiliary units were among the first British soldiers to be trained in the use of time pencils, the ingenious copper tube delay fuses that allowed a saboteur to plant a charge and be miles away before it detonated. They practiced on live railway lines, disused sidings, and farm equipment selected to replicate the dimensions of German vehicles and supply infrastructure. Their target list, had invasion come, was instructive, not frontline troops. The auxiliary units were explicitly told they were not to engage in pitched combat, which they could not survive. Their targets were logistics, fuel dumps, ammunition stores, railway junctions, staff vehicles, and the command infrastructure that any occupying force would depend upon to consolidate its position. The calculation was that a well-placed patrol, striking repeatedly and then disappearing back into the earth, could impose a disproportionate cost on an enemy trying to establish control of occupied territory. The OBs were distributed predominantly across the counties most exposed to the anticipated invasion routes. Kent, Sussex, Suffolk, Norfolk, and the coastal reaches of Devon and Cornwall held the highest concentrations. Further inland, a second belt of patrols was positioned along the line of the GHQ defensive position, the stop line that British planners hoped would serve as the last coherent defensive barrier if the coast was lost. Estimates place the total number of operational bases constructed at somewhere between 500 and 550, though the exact figure remains difficult to confirm because many were never formally recorded and some were constructed off the official programme by local commanders acting on their own initiative. What is certain is that by the autumn of 1940, hundreds of men across the length of southern and eastern England were leading a kind of double existence. By day they were farmhands, gamekeepers, and estate workers. by night, on training evenings, on the regular exercises that Coleshill imposed to keep the patrols sharp. They were disappearing into holes in the ground and practicing the destruction of infrastructure, with a precision that would have alarmed any German intelligence officer who had known what was happening in the hedgerows of the English countryside. The psychological dimension of this existence should not be underestimated. These men had taken an oath of secrecy so stringent that most did not tell their wives what they were doing. The explosives and specialist weapons stored in the OBs, quantities that would have attracted serious legal scrutiny under any normal circumstances, were simply kept in the ground, unacknowledged. Wives and children living within 100 metres of buried chambers containing kilograms of plastic explosive and an assortment of devices designed for close-quarter killing went about their daily lives in complete ignorance. The secrecy held, almost without exception, for decades. Attempts at a direct comparison with German preparations are complicated by a fundamental asymmetry. Germany was never on the defensive in the West in the way Britain was in 1940, and so never developed a precisely equivalent structure for stay-behind operations on home soil. The German werewolf program, hastily assembled in the dying months of the war, bears some superficial resemblance to the auxiliary units in its intent, a network of trained saboteurs left behind enemy lines to harass occupying forces, but it was conceived too late, resourced too poorly, and ultimately achieved almost nothing. The auxiliary units, by contrast, were funded, equipped, and trained to a standard that, by 1941, was genuinely impressive. The American Office of Strategic Services, many of whose early personnel passed through the SOE training pipeline that shared instructors and methods with the auxiliary units program, developed comparable doctrine for agent networks in occupied territory. But the auxiliary units were distinct in one critical respect. They were not agents infiltrated into hostile territory. They were indigenous civilians defending their own ground. The OB was not a safe house in Paris or a dead drop in Brussels. It was a hole in the earth beneath a field that the man defending it had ploughed, planted, and harvested for 20 years. The Soviets' partisan infrastructure, developed partly in response to the German invasion of 1941, was arguably the largest comparable operation of the war. But it operated at a scale, in a terrain, and under conditions so different from the English countryside as to render direct comparison almost meaningless. The auxiliary units remain, in their specific combination of civilian recruitment, indigenous territorial knowledge, and purpose-built subterranean infrastructure, essentially without parallel. The invasion never came. Operation Sea Lion was postponed in September 1940 and never rescheduled. The Luftwaffe's failure to achieve the air superiority that the operation required, combined with the logistical difficulties of a cross-channel assault against a defended coastline, persuaded the German High Command that the enterprise carried too high a risk. Britain was not invaded. The auxiliary units therefore never fired a shot in anger. The OBs, stocked with their explosives and their specialist weapons and their tins of food and their packs of playing cards, were never activated for combat. The men continued their exercises through 1941, through 1942, and into 1943, maintaining their readiness as the strategic situation shifted and the threat of invasion receded. The organisation was formally stood down in late 1944, and its records, to a degree that still frustrates historians, were destroyed or scattered. Assessing the impact of the auxiliary units is therefore a hypothetical exercise, but it is not a pointless one. Military historians who have examined the German logistics chain during the opening phases of the proposed invasion have generally concluded that a network of trained saboteurs operating across the occupied counties, targeting fuel and ammunition stores, could have imposed delays and supply failures significant enough to affect operational tempo. Whether those delays would have been decisive is impossible to say. What is clear is that the planners at Coleshill believed it sufficiently that they put 3,500 men into the ground and kept them there for 4 years. Several examples of OBS survive and are accessible to the public today. Coleshill House itself, now maintained by the National Trust, preserves the setting, if not the structure, of the original training facility. A number of preserved OBs can be found in Kent, Suffolk, and Wiltshire, and the Coleshill Auxiliary Research Team has done substantial work in locating, documenting, and in some cases excavating chambers that had been sealed and forgotten for decades. Walking into one of these surviving structures crouching through the narrow entrance shaft, dropping into the low-ceilinged chamber beyond, standing in the half-darkness with the earth pressing in on every side, produces a peculiar and powerful sensation, a sense of the peculiar courage that it takes not to do something, but to wait. Return, then, to that Kent hillside. The mist has burned off now, and the farmer is back at his work. The men in the ground below have heard him pass, heard the familiar clump of his boots, recognised the pattern of his movement, and have said nothing. They will wait out the day. Tonight, when darkness comes, they will climb out of the earth, move through the fields they know better than their own faces, and practice the destruction of a target they will never, as it happens, actually destroy. They are farmers and gamekeepers and foresters. They are fathers and brothers and neighbours. They are men who said yes to a question they were told they might not survive answering, who signed nothing, that acknowledged what they were doing, who built small rooms in the earth and spent years of their lives in them, waiting for a catastrophe that Providence and the RAF conspired, just barely, to prevent. Consider what it means to prepare for the worst with absolute seriousness, and then to be spared the worst, and to say nothing about either experience for the rest of your life. Consider what it means to carry, in the quiet of an ordinary rural existence, the knowledge that you once put 4 pounds of plastic explosive into a hole in the ground and stood ready to use it against the forces of an occupying army on the soil of your own country. These men were never decorated. Their organisation was never publicly acknowledged during the war. Many of them died without their families ever knowing the full extent of what they had done or been prepared to do. The operational bases are mostly gone now, collapsed, buried deeper, absorbed back into the land that concealed them. A few remain, preserved and documented, windows into a peculiar and largely forgotten chapter of British wartime experience. But the real monument to the auxiliary units is invisible. It is the absence of the war they were built to fight, and the quiet courage of the men who were ready, when it came to it, to disappear into the earth and become ghosts for their country. They waited. The worst did not come. And they said nothing. That, in the end, is exactly what they had been asked to do.